Welcome to Multiple Perspectives. I'm David Lofgren. Today, we're diving into one of the more intriguing corners of the commercial real estate market, healthcare properties, also known as medical office buildings. As the demand for outpatient medical and dental facilities grows, driven by shifting demographics, technological advancements, and decentralized care models, this asset class presents a unique opportunity for self-directed investors looking to diversify their portfolios. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Trisha Talbot, Managing Principal of Doc Properties and a leading voice in the healthcare real estate space. Trisha has spent over 20 years bringing together sort of entrepreneurial clinicians and investors to create thriving outpatient healthcare investments. And she's here to share her investments on how this niche is adapting to a rapidly evolving landscape. Trisha, welcome to Multiple Perspectives.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Your career has been defined by, connecting clinicians and investors to create thriving healthcare real estate ventures. What initially drew you to focus on outpatient medical and dental facilities? How did you get into this very sort of niche asset class?
So I started my real estate career and I was actually going to school for my MBA at the same time. I don't recommend that. But I answered an ad or request to do a marketing report for a medical office developer. So they were putting a new medical office building next to a hospital, and they needed to do kind of, just like a demographic study and, supply, demand, that sort of thing. Just sort of like does the market need this and what does it look like? So I did that, and they then hired me in their leasing department. So I started in their in-house leasing department, and since they just focused on medical office, that's, all we did. And they had some office, but mostly medical office. And then from there, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing the medical deals more than the office deals. Getting to know, I just felt like it was, I don't know, I kind of like puzzles. And so, it was more of a puzzle than, putting, and nothing to, bad about office. Those are, were easy deals. But, with medical, you got to kind of figure out, well, does this make sense for your use? And, what I enjoyed was that, these clinicians, they really need this office space to operate their business. If they're private, it's a small business trying to figure out their occupancy costs and not to go over budget with TIs. And if it's a hospital, it's more like, okay, this needs to fit into our plan. This is how we know a successful space works, and how do we get from this space to a space that we work. So I guess I liked I just enjoyed having those conversations rather than, okay, we need external offices and a bullpen and
Right. As real estate transactions go, these are incredibly complicated sort of trying to match needs with what actually exists. Yeah.
And if they're private physicians, they really depended on your expertise and advice. Some of them, they had opened up offices before, some of them haven't. And even if they did have other office spaces, every market's different. The economy is different in certain sort of things. So there's different things you can ask for, how to guide them from, of course, they want everything, but, to really say, hey, if you really want to make this deal, this is how this works. And then I did leasing. I started out in leasing and then moved into investment sales. And that was even solving bigger things, especially if they came to me like physician owned. And, then I kind of sort of bit off a lot more than I probably wanted to chew, because it got into, sometimes they were selling because the partnership was failing. And that sort of got into a little bit more of legal issues where, that's not my wheelhouse, obviously. And, I started saying, you guys are putting the value of the real estate, in peril if you don't work out your legal partnership, situation, and everyone loses. Trying to get the emotion or whatever, conflict that they had, sort of kind of putting a pin in it and saying, look, let's get the real estate sold. Let's get everybody pay everybody. And then kind of the problem gets solved. And then, kind of making it, again, I think taking the emotion out of a real estate transaction for anybody that's not a real estate professional is obviously really sometimes a challenge because they're emotionally attached to this piece of real estate.
Of course.
Even in like my husband wants to like be buried in our backyard at our house. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I want to, like when the kids are gone, I want to sell this. I want to have 2 lock and leave places in 2 different locations. Like I could, I could move in a month. And he's like, ah. So, I feel it. I see it every day.
But I painted that bathroom.
You what?
But I painted that bathroom. Yeah, everyone's got some sort of like, emotional connection.
He is not a handyman. He has not painted anything. No, he has not. So it's taking the emotion out of a real estate decision and being like, how do we get the most value out of it? And I know for everybody, it's not just a real estate decision. Even for physicians, it's and even practices, it's the real estate functions as a part of the whole. But after once you decide that you don't need that location anymore, or it's not serving you or whatever, then it becomes a financial transaction and not anything else. And, once you get to that point, then, you can sell it. So those started becoming really good conversations, and then selling them, you have to educate the buyers. You have to talk to the buyers about the tenants. You got to get them up to speed. Like that whole process was really fun. And now I feel like I'm in the different process where I was solving all those problems for other people. Now I'm like, look, I know what a good medical building is or isn't. I know, if it needs some, if it does have some vacancy, I can fill it based on, what I know of the market. And, I really think I can solve some problems if there are any, and, really maintain the value of an asset and be able to keep it a financial process where, and allowing, if they are clinicians and they, they're going to occupy space in the building, have them, if they, want to be part of the deal or not, kind of figuring that out. But they're passive. So all the decisions get made by real estate professionals that have no emotion in no emotion in the building, which is what it should be, based on, this is what we're going to do based on the macro market. This is what we're going to do based on, where this asset is, the long-term plan for it, and how to get out of it where everyone makes money and doesn't lose money, kind of making it more simplistic than it is. But that's, where I'm at now.
So help me understand how you actually structure these deals then. So sometimes the investors are the clinicians who are practicing in the space. Is that always the case? Or are you sort of helping folks who are clinicians invest in other spaces? Are you pulling together a bunch of different investors? Like, bring me through that process
Sure.
of how it normally works for you.
It's like anything. It's raising debt and equity. If a clinician group they're like, I want to buy this building. Can you put this deal together? My company, I can be a little flexible because I'm not a huge institution. So the institutional investors, they have like, because they need to, because of how big they are and how many, how much overhead they have and other things, they have like typically one specific structure that they want to do. Mine are, middle market-ish. And so I don't, I have like an outline, but I can sort of plug in pieces. So, I do have a client that's an investment group. They're looking to buy a building. They don't have the capital themselves. So they would have to sign a long-term lease. And, I would have to go and raise capital and debt to put the deal together. And, if they want to be an investor in it, they can put money in. If we want to structure a deal where they're like, hey, I want a piece of ownership for, bringing this in, kind of like a finder's fee for themselves, we can kind of structure something like that and they can get some equity. Then it just becomes like, there's a mathematical model that I have to, adjust for the different things. Or I find a building and just, raise the debt and equity through outside investors, and everyone's a passive investor. And we do it that way. Some of them can be, I have a large interest group from, clinicians that do want to invest. regardless, they don't have to occupy. They're not in it, in the building. They're just investing in it. It's, I think it's easy for them to understand. It's an easy asset for them to get their arms around rather than somebody saying, I want to, sell these blue widgets, and then they have to understand what the widget is and the market and
Right.
you know what I mean? Like this, they're like,
Right.
okay, this is a medical building. I understand the tenant.
I work in a medical building. Right.
Yeah, it makes sense. I understand, and then, you kind of tell them their long-term leases, the annual increases, that sort of thing. If it's more value add, those are a little trickier these days just because, I do have debt as part of the component, and banks, they're depending on the bank and where they are with what they have in commercial real estate. It's sometimes the value adds are harder to sell for them.
Right. They're going to keep an eye on that LTV.
Yeah. They're risk averse right now.
Right.
Very risk averse.
Right.
It makes sense.
So are you guys making these investments and then holding onto them for the long haul? Are you sort of packaging them and trying to then roll them up into something for an institutional investor? Like, what's the actual business plan sort of from the 10,000 foot view?
Yeah. I mean, I think enjoying the cash flow. But if, you get an offer you can't refuse. Again, I mean, I obviously I speak to a lot of people and they're like, I'm never selling. And so I won't say I'll never sell. I mean, if you want to pay a huge premium, I'll sell it and we'll, go on and do the next one. But the goal is to hold it for some time. And then, again, it's what the opportunity offers. So, yeah, I mean, obviously putting a few of them together and aggregating them and then selling them to a larger company that wants to take them from there. That's, something that can happen if we end up accumulating a lot and they end up sort of having, a lot of it comes with the lease term. So, just packaging them together where it makes sense. I could easily do that. I think it depends on what the future holds.
I'm curious, it feels like we're in the midst of some like major shifts in the healthcare industry. I mean, not least of which is like the youngest member of the baby boomer generation, I think, will reach retirement on or just before 2030. So we're like, we're in the midst of this sort of big flip in sort of demand drivers in the industry. I wonder if there are like signals that you're keeping an eye on, or like demographic trends, economic trends that you're sort of like, advising other investors keep an eye on to try and figure out where the market's moving.
I think medical office is going to be needed, and I think it's actually going to be needed more as we go forward. So it's interesting you say that because I was just at a presentation and so the baby boomers and Gen X and when you even put them together versus the number of people that are millennials, which are the children of the baby boomers, and then I think it's Gen Z, which is like my children. The Gen Z and the millennials actually make up more of the population than the baby boomers and the Gen X's. And so it's just going to continue, the need, it's population driven. Obviously, the baby boomers are going to get a lot of, they're going to need a lot of healthcare just because of aging. But the millennials are having kids. So, I mean, and then those kids need care. I mean, so, pediatrics, not every adult gets a physical every year, but in pediatrics, they do.
Sure.
All the way up until they're 18. So there's obviously there's illnesses and there's sports injuries. And, I know we had concussion checks every couple of years. So, for baselines. So, there's just, I think, a constant need. And every generation needs different healthcare differently. Baby boomers get a lot of the news just because of their age. And obviously, statistically speaking, they, as you get older, you use more healthcare services.
Sure.
But then after they pass, then it's the Gen, then, we're all going to use them. I mean, hopefully not for a while, but, and then the next generation again. So it's just going to continue to flow.
Right. I mean, that's interesting. Do you think about your investments, like as far as trying to diversify tenant profiles? Like, are you thinking about that? Obviously, like you say, the boomers get the headlines right now, but the truth is, and as a parent, you know this, it's like there are healthcare costs across the spectrum of life, and certainly across the sort of spectrum of needs more broadly. Is that something that you try and balance, or that you can balance for as a sponsor or a property owner, or is that just something that you sort of hope
No,
for?
when I look at a medical building, if I see that it's, you have to have I think, a comprehensive tenant mix, and you don't always get it, but you try to have like a primary care and then the specialists, to continue to, if you, in different things, so like a pediatrician and maybe an internist, so you get both, um, and then that feeds into the different specialties. So and then a physical therapist. But if I go into a place and it's like a med spa, a chiropractor, and a physical therapist, unless they're national tenants, I would probably be a little bit cautious about that, just because physical therapist is wide open space, chiropractors usually just a couple rooms, and then med spa. While med spas, they are hugely successful. So I wouldn't mind having a med spa in a building, but I don't want like it to be one of like 33% of the building, for, just to kind of make round numbers, just because they can pick up and move pretty easily.
Oh, interesting. So sort of the specificity of the needs of the space in some ways helps you understand the stickiness of your tenant profile.
Yeah. So, if you're a cardiology group and you've built it out with, a bunch of stress test equipment, and you've invested a lot in the space, it's unlikely you're going to move. Now, there's a trend where, hospital groups buy them. So you just got to kind of look at the lease. But in general, practices get, if they invest money in a space, they're not going to pick up and leave just because then they have to do it all over again.
Interesting. So, I wonder if the investors that are coming to you are physicians or practitioners of some sort, that makes sense. There's a lot of alignment between sort of their understanding of real estate and what you're offering. Something that we, encounter quite a bit at Equity Multiple is that people might have some sort of understanding of a facet of real estate, be it, they understand industrial because that's the world they work in. They own a construction company or something, or they understand or they understand office buildings, or vaguely understand residential. But, the more niche the asset class is, I think the more investors tend to think, I don't know, like it's going to be hard for me to learn enough to feel really comfortable doing my due diligence, to get into this offering. And I'm wondering, what you do to sort of help folks who aren't as immediately familiar, or maybe even if it's, physicians who are investing, but, in a sort of a facet of medical office that just they don't really know much about. Like, how do you sort of help people understand what the industry looks like and sort of what factors they need to consider before they can feel comfortable with the investment?
Well, I mean, that's a lot of one-on-one conversations and answering a lot of questions. I mean, I hope that my package, answers a lot of the financial, and there's and the market specific, and then drills down into the building, and then from there, whatever questions they have, sort of fill in the blanks for them. And I've got, actually, you say this, and I have two books. I mean, they're not going to win any Pulitzer Prizes or anything, but it's for this exact situation, where it gives like just the overview of what medical offices are, why they're important, how to, in general, what you're looking for, what you should be looking for as an investor. And I think that helps a little bit, at least get to some sort of baseline. So it helps when I'm getting investors. And I'm also trying to educate the clinicians on the other side, like if they do come to me with a building, kind of like what it needs to look like. I mean, so a lot of clinician-owned buildings, they don't come to me with a lot of runway. They kind of say, hey, I'm retiring in 2 years and I want to, get out of my building. And, and you're like, okay, well, to me or any bank, that's a vacant property. And so, and they don't understand that and what they should be doing is coming to me, 12 to 10 years before they want to end their career so that, they can get the most value out of their building then. And then they, become a tenant. And then when they're done practicing, they're done with the real estate. The investor at that point can anticipate them leaving and backfill their building, if they're not going to stay or they don't sell their practice or what have you. But
that's fascinating. That's like a little bit counterintuitive. No. You want to become the tenant in order to maximize the value of the sale of the underlying real estate.
Right. I mean, when you're looking, especially if it's like and I'm talking mostly single tenant, clinician owned buildings. So if they come and they're like, I want to sell my property, and but I'm going to be done practicing in a couple of years. You're like, then it's a vacant building. So that's, one, just like understanding what makes a medical property valuable for sure. And there's different things. I mean, different locations, deferred maintenance. And I go back, and I don't mean to keep ragging on clinicians, but, it's interesting because their day to day is serving patients. So the real estate sometimes gets, just because of bandwidth. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just, bandwidth. It tends to get a little bit deferred maintenance. I was just talking to this morning, like, especially if it's like a surgery center, there's like compliance that they have to keep up with. And I heard a story about someone, their air conditioning like broke. And then here in Phoenix, of course, it breaks always in July and August. And then, they go out to fix it and the filter hasn't been changed for 2 years just because, when they're hiring office staff, they're not like, they don't hire a facilities person because it's like 1 or 2 buildings.
Right. You don't have a property manager you can rely on.
Yeah. And even then, like, they have to like call the property manager during normal business hours. Well, if they're seeing patients or they're in surgery, like, then they want to call the property manager at like, when they're on their way home at 7:00 at night. And the property manager is probably not going to answer. And then the property manager gets in, gets their coffee, checks their email. It's 8:30 in the morning the next day. And then they're already seeing patients. So it doesn't, it doesn't really, or they like send all these emails, but then again, can they physically get to the email? I don't know. Like, it just, it's interesting, like how sometimes they try to maintain both things. And the problem is real estate, though. I mean, even like if they're doing tenant improvements and they want to talk to the contractor, like a contractor in Arizona, especially, like they'll start at 6 a.m. and be done by 3, especially in the summer or even earlier. So again, like, how do you logistically like understand, like, you're like, it's an intelligent group and they understand that, but like bandwidth and logistically, can you be a successful real estate investor? Because you can be an unsuccessful real estate investor if you want to you. But if you want to be a successful real estate investor and have a successful practice, you're one human being with 24 hours in the day. So I don't know how that happens.
So how do you think about that sort of, it's one thing to say, okay, I have my primary business, and, we talk to a lot of physicians on this podcast, and oftentimes, I think it's surprising for folks who aren't in the medical industry to understand that a lot of physicians are functionally small business people, right? They're running a small business, and you learn a lot about how to practice your craft when you're in medical school. You don't necessarily get a lot of information about how to run a small business successfully. So there's that sort of struggle. Then if you're also going to try and purchase your property, if you're, then you're also a real estate investor, a very direct, very impacted by the quality of the real estate investor. So there's not a lot of sort of diversification there in the ways that you're investing your time and your capital. I wonder, as you're helping people understand how to diversify their portfolios and how to sort of spread their investments, maybe even if it's all in the same asset class, at least putting not all of the eggs in one basket, what kind of advice are you giving folks? Is there, an approach, like say a geographic diversification that you recommend? Is there, are there other ways that you think about just sort of trying to spread out the risk?
when someone looks at their investment portfolio, they tend to like lump all real estate in like one, like, okay, I'm going to have this amount in real estate. And not every piece of real estate is the same. And so even in real estate, there's some diversification to be had. Medical office, I would say, is more of a steady Eddie one. Multifamily has I don't know right now, but in the past, that's been kind of the sexy one where they like say all these high returns. But now I think there's a little bit of overbuilt and, some properties are getting older and they need more maintenance. So and I'm not a multifamily person. So, all I know is there was like a ton of construction, and then industrial, that last mile stuff is getting, and data centers and things like that, are one type of investment. Obviously there's, land, which you don't get much income on, and then, or any income unless you're leasing it. And then there's retail. So I kind of, and I hear your question. And so I explained this a little bit too, in one of my books. So I sort of kind of so real estate's supposed to be in like 5 figures, like, industrial, office, retail, apartments, and land. So kind of in that sort of thing. But I'm kind of like, is your real estate going to be influenced by like a pandemic effect, an Amazon effect, or, can something really change the behaviors? Well, we've seen it in retail, to some extent. And so I think then it's going to the last mile centers.
We've definitely seen it in traditional office.
So office has had the pandemic effect. And then, the apartments, it's affected a lot by consumer spending. I mean, yes, people always need a place to live. But, if push comes to shove, I'm like, worst case scenario, like people start moving back in with their parents. There's different ways that you can solve having a roof over your head. With medical office, it's a little bit different because, yes, telemedicine has become part of it. And I think it's actually a beneficial part, to help complement it. But if you're going to have a procedure, you have to go into a facility. I guess you could say there's like black market stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about normal people that have insurance are going to,
right.
And under normal circumstances, normal people, but under normal circumstances, you will use your insurance, or if you're uninsured, same thing, but you're going to go into a hospital, you're going to go into a facility to have an examination. So a doctor will probably use telemedicine to do like an initial consultation to answer some questions, and have a discussion, but then they're going to say, okay, I need you to come in and I need to examine you. I mean, they have to take your heart rate. Even like if they're going in for surgery or getting anesthetized, you have to make sure that, the person's healthy. So they need to see you. They need to take your vitals. I mean, you can't do that over the phone. And I don't think you would see a physician be like, yeah, I'm going to operate on you because you're going to take your own vitals. Like, I don't think that's ever going to happen. So I feel like, and other people that have expertise in other real estate can say their own justifications, but I think that medical office is something that is going to remain because of the function of its purpose.
Sure. I want to go back to the telehealth thing because I think it is one of those, obviously since the pandemic, whatever, momentum there was towards telehealth sort of accelerated. And I think for...
That's because Medicare paid for it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And, I think for the uninitiated, there might be some questions about like, oh, telehealth, is that like work from home? Does that mean that the value of medical space might be, impacted negatively? But you're saying that you think it's actually a net positive.
So I think if they use it correctly. So, I think if... especially in urgent care, I think, not necessarily strep throat, but, urinary tract infections or, maybe strep throat, sinus infections. If you can call an urgent care and your medical history isn't complicated and you're like, I have a billion of these, I get them all the time. I just need like a Z-Pack or, whatever. And I think it solves some of that for urgent care centers. I think it keeps people from using the ER as their primary care or urgent care center, which is a huge, issue because people do that. And it's a huge cost on the healthcare system to go into the ER for a urinary tract infection. The ER is there for acute. It's supposed to be for acute patients, and they get you stable, and then they don't even want to admit you if they can stabilize you, and you go to your primary care physician the next day. It's for really critical care patients and trauma. So I think one, telehealth adds some value. I think it can create some efficiency. So like a doctor can say, okay, I have these consults every 20 minutes from 8 to noon. And it's initial consults. It's like, okay, what are you looking to accomplish, especially for like surgeries, either cosmetic or, or they're elective surgeries in the definition of elective. They're not trauma. So, this is kind of, I can explain the process, sometimes explain the costs, explain the recovery, and then say, okay, if this meets with your expectations, let's schedule, an exam, and then like a pre-op exam, and then, we'll get scheduled for surgery. And then post-op, depending on the surgery and depending on the clinician, they may just want you to come in and, to check and see if anything's like bleeding or oozing or whatever. But if not, if it's just like, hey, maybe like 24 hours after the surgery, like, how are you doing? How's the pain? How are you handling the pain? I think that can add value to the entire, kind of care that they offer. But like I said, you're not going to perform surgery over telehealth. So, but I think it can I think it can improve efficiency. It can reduce some costs for people that, want to come in for a surgery that might be a couple hours away. At first they can have the consult up front, and then, if they agree, sometimes the physician can probably, look at your medical records and talk to you about different ways that they can solve your problem surgically, and have those discussions, and then have you think about it before you decide. And I think all of those help everybody. But again, it's not going to turn medical real estate on its head, because people actually have to come in.
Right. There's still a lot of demand for the tools and the people in those spaces.
Yeah.
So, something that I think is an interesting question to ask in the context of a lot of different real estate is that, and this is particularly sort of resonant in medical facilities, is that, you're essentially trying to serve a dual purpose here. And those purposes are both like delivering high quality patient care, facilitating the delivery of high quality patient care at least, while also generating returns for investors. And I wonder how you think about balancing those sort of two needs, sort of how you balance creating spaces that both meet a high clinical standard and also ensure, financial profitability for stakeholders.
So, it's occupancy costs, and occupancy costs are a function of, one, the market, but two, the costs to construct a building, and then, the cost to construct tenant improvements. You can't run a medical building at a loss. It is a profit center. But again, like at what profit center? I think everything I do is fair market with, a profit margin built in, because otherwise you're not going to get people to build medical buildings. And then, then there's operating costs and everything like that. So there are costs that have to be covered. And those aren't going down, for anybody. Property taxes and building insurance. Building insurance is ridiculously continuing to increase. And with, all these natural disasters, it's going to be interesting to see if it's even economic. If the cost of insurance isn't going to be like economically feasible. But
right. Something we're looking at in a lot of markets.
Right. So those costs always go up, and they have to be covered. I hear what you're saying, and I don't know that I have a solution, because there's a real estate cost to build, own, and operate a property, and it has to be at a profit in order to get investors to do it. I think the question is, how does the healthcare industry run a business based on insurance reimbursements that aren't keeping up with inflation and have all of these costs, which is that is an issue. And that's why a lot of private practices ended up, there was a trend where some private practices, they get bought by private equity or they get bought by hospitals because the individual practitioner or like a partnership can't keep up with the increasing costs and even like the electronic medical records that's required and all of that. So it is a question on how the healthcare industry can continue to pay for buildings that it was required to have procedures in when their reimbursements are and their costs, their reimbursements are lowering and costs are increasing. Yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue to solve for sure.
Yeah,
but it's out of my scope because I can't solve the healthcare industry. Yeah. Like I can't.
Not something we're going to solve in one podcast episode for sure.
It's very, very complex. I mean, it's just the amount of regulations and then the bureaucracy that's involved. It's tough.
Yeah. Fascinating. You've mentioned your book, or your two books, at points in this podcast, and I don't want to ignore that. I mean, you said they might not win a Pulitzer Prize, but luckily our audience is not the Pulitzer Committee. Our audience are people who, are interested in commercial real estate investing and might be specifically interested in medical office investing. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your two books, and of course, we'll be sure to put links to them in the show notes.
Sure. So the first one is Essential, and it's just kind of an overview of the medical office market and, what makes sort of in general kind of, a good medical office building to invest in. And on my webpage, which is .properties.com, there is a link to sign up for a free copy. It's also on Amazon if you want to buy like your own hard copy. Otherwise, there's a link where you can get an electronic copy. And then the newest one is specifically for like investing in sale leasebacks and what you need to be aware of and what makes a successful sale leaseback, because that's, specific to having a clinician in there. And it's not just the clinician, like how financially viable are they? You really need to do like a bunch of due diligence. And so that one's called Strategic Gains. And that one's on Amazon right now. I've just finished it. So I still need to like create but that'll be on my webpage and for a link to a free copy. Right now you can just Google it on Amazon. And if you want a hard copy immediately before I have the link to it. But that one's just because a lot of people are, I think sale leasebacks add a different flavor. There's, you really need to know the tenant that it's not just a real estate transaction. I mean, it is a real estate transaction, but it's only as valuable and risk averse as the tenant that's in there.
Right. Fascinating. Well, Trisha Talbot, author of Essential and Strategic Gains. Is that what the new one's called?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Multiple Perspectives. Thanks again to Trisha for joining me. If you enjoyed today's discussion and you want to hear more of what Trisha has to say or want links to the books that she's published, you can find links to her work in the show notes for today's episode. If you want to learn about the real estate investing opportunities that we have on the Equity Multiple platform, we've got links for that too. Thanks for joining me once again here on Multiple Perspectives. I'm David Lofgren, and as always, you can let me know what you think of the show via our email, multipleperspectives@equitymultiple.com. Also, if you enjoy the show and you want to give us a little boost, you want to help us spread the word a bit more about this show, as always, you can rate and review us on Apple or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to know what you think.